Hi, my name is Eekhof, and I'll be presenting work that I've done with Raymond Marr about the effect of reading narrative fiction on social curiosity. Before I start, I would like to draw your attention to the fact that the paper of this project has recently been published in Language and Cognition. So if you're interested in this work, you can check out the open access publication. We've also made all of our materials, data, and code available on the Open Science Framework. And we've also pre-registered this study, and that is also openly available online. The study was carried out in the context of existing literature on the effect that reading narrative fiction may have on social cognitive abilities, such as empathy and mind reading. And the leading idea in this field is nicely summarized in Raymond Marr's 2018 Spacen model, which argues that narratives may positively affect social cognition because narratives simulate the real social world. And as such, they engage the same social cognitive abilities that we also use in our daily life to understand others. Repeated exposure to narratives may thus function as a form of training for these skills. And in addition, narratives can also offer useful knowledge and perspectives that we can apply in social contexts. Empirical studies have first tested these ideas by mapping out the associations between reading habits and social cognitive performance and development. And these studies show quite consistently that lifelong exposure to narrative fiction predicts better social cognitive performance in adults, advanced social emotional development in early childhood, and better social adjustment in older children. However, these correlational studies do not provide direct causal evidence that reading narrative fiction improves social cognition. An alternative explanation could be, for example, that people with better social cognitive abilities simply enjoy reading more. That's why other scholars have conducted experiments in which participants are usually assigned to read either a single piece of literary fiction, popular fiction, expository nonfiction, or nothing at all. And a landmark study from 2013 found that those who had read a piece of literary fiction outperformed the other groups on measures of social cognition directly after reading. However, several other labs were not able to replicate this finding, but a meta-analysis in 2018 did conclude that there is a small effect of reading a piece of literary fiction on social cognition when compared with reading a piece of expository nonfiction or nothing at all. Zooming in on these experimental single exposure studies, we see that aside from the mixed bag of evidence in favor of a direct effect of reading narrative fiction, there are more concerns. Firstly, two P-curve analyses found that both the original studies in the Castano 2013 paper, as well as studies included in the meta-analysis from 2018, lacked evidential value. So in other words, the evidence in favor of a direct effect of a single exposure to a narrative on social cognition is inconclusive at best. When looking at the more theoretical level, it should also be noted that a rationale as to why a single exposure to a piece of narrative fiction would impact social cognitive performance is lacking. In fact, most of the existing accounts on the benefits of reading narratives stress that repeated, prolonged exposure to narratives is needed to make a meaningful, lasting impact on social cognition. An explanation for the single exposure effect that has been around is that reading even a single narrative could perhaps prime social cognitive abilities and make them more readily available during subsequent social cognitive tasks. But this does not explain why this effect is not observed consistently, and also whether the effect, if it exists at all, really reflects an improvement in ability, or perhaps some other more temporary process. So in other words, the initial question that drove this project was not only whether a single exposure to narrative improves social cognition, but also why. In this project, we proposed an alternative to the priming account, namely the social curiosity account. We argue that perhaps a single exposure to a narrative does not really affect the ability to understand others, but rather the interest or motivation to do so. And because we know that several social cognitive abilities have a motivational component, this heightened social curiosity might, in turn, temporarily increase social cognitive performance. So our hypothesis going into this study was that exposure to a piece of narrative fiction, as opposed to expository nonfiction, might increase social curiosity, which can be defined as an interest in other people and the way they think, feel, and behave. To test this hypothesis, we designed a study in which 222 native speakers of English were assigned to either read one chapter of narrative fiction or one chapter of expository nonfiction. And after reading, we tested their social curiosity, both on a state level, so their current interest in other people, as well as their trait level, so their relatively stable interest in other people in daily life. For the text, we chose individual chapters of books that were about 2,000 words long each, could be understood in isolation, and were accessible for a broad audience. Specifically for the narrative fiction condition, we chose 4 chapters from books that were in the top 10 most popular books on the ebook platform Overdrive as of June 22 for 4 common fictional genres. For the expository nonfiction condition, we chose chapters from works that were written in a non-narrative style and did not cover any interpersonal topics. To measure social curiosity, we distinguish between trait social curiosity, which reflects participants' relatively stable interest in other people and which was something that we wanted to control for in our analyses, and state social curiosity, which reflects participants' current interest in other people and which is our main measure of interest. We measured trait social curiosity with an existing scale that consists of 10 items, like I find it fascinating to get to know new people. Because there was no existing measure of state social curiosity, we developed our own task, which we called the State Inventory of Social Curiosity. And in this task, people were presented with 6 profiles, which consisted of a picture of a person with a short description including their hobbies and their profession. And after viewing each profile, participants were asked to rate their agreement with 3 statements measuring their interest in the person in that profile. We ensured that there was enough variability in gender and interestingness of the profile to avoid floor and ceiling effects. And I will give you 2 examples of that. A relatively boring and thus hard stimulus who looks like this. This is a woman who works as an accountant and enjoys gardening and going to church. And a more easy stimulus that is a bit more interesting looks like this. This is someone who works as a photographer and enjoys collecting vinyl records and going for walks with their dog. And after each profile, participants were presented with these 3 statements, and they had to rate them on a 7-point Likert scale. And then we averaged over all of the statements for all of the profiles to create one index variable for state social curiosity. To test our main hypothesis, we ran a linear regression with CISC scores. So those are scores on our newly developed state measure as the dependent variable, including gender and condition as the factors of interest. And in this figure, I have plotted CISC scores by gender. So we have women in the upper panel and men in the lower panel, and by condition. So the narrative scores are in purple and the expository ones in blue. And when we look at this figure, we can see 2 of our main findings. Firstly, contrary to our own hypothesis, we find that reading a piece of exposition actually leads to higher scores of social curiosity. And when comparing the upper and the lower panel, we also see that women are slightly more socially curious than men. We also did some additional analyses to see if these findings were influenced by participants' trait social curiosity, but that did not seem to be the case. We also plotted the CISC scores by individual text. Again, you can see the narrative text in purple and the expository ones in blue. I've sorted the text by CISC score, so the text that led to the highest CISC score is on the top, and the one that led to the lowest score is on the bottom. And we can note a few things here. First of all, there are these boxes that give some characteristics of the text, namely the length of the text and a measure of difficulty. And it does not seem to be the case that these surface characteristics correlate with these DISC scores. So the effect we found does not seem to be driven by these kind of surface characteristics of the text. Again, we also see that overall the expository text led to higher CISC scores than the narrative text in purple. But we also see that the texts are not perfectly sorted by condition. There is some variability there. And we actually noticed a pattern. The text leading to the highest CISC score is this text, which is a very factual, dry text about the history of prisons in the US. And the text that led to the lowest CISC scores is a highly socially complex text, which features a narrative main character who tries to figure out what another character is thinking. So this is a text that is very social and centers around mindfulness. In between, we see that there are both narrative and expository texts that are not necessarily social or non-social in nature. So for example, this text tells us the history of the potato, so it's expository, but it focuses on the social significance of the potato. And the text below that, the Paris apartment, is a narrative, and it features two characters, but there is no interaction between two characters. This led us to think that perhaps the effect of text genre on social curiosity was driven by the degree to which the text presents social targets that readers can engage with, rather than whether the text is necessarily narrative or not. And we explored this in an additional non-preregistered analysis using the following approach. To quantify the degree to which text presented social targets, we coded each text for the presence of viewpoint markers. And viewpoint markers, also called perspective markers, are content words that express someone's perspective. And I'll give some examples in a minute. And we then calculated a viewpoint score for each text by taking the percentage of viewpoint markers out of the total number of words. Here are some examples of the text with the viewpoint markers. And here the perceptual viewpoint markers are in blue. So these are words related to perception and sensation. Cognitive viewpoint markers are in green. So these are words related to thoughts, beliefs, and intentions. And emotional viewpoint markers are in yellow. So these are words related to emotions. And here's another example from an expository text. I should note that both narrative and expository texts can contain viewpoint or perspective markers, but they are considered more characteristic of narratives because narratives are by definition perspectivized. After calculating a viewpoint score for each text, we then ran another linear regression with CISC scores as the dependent variable and viewpoint score and gender as the factors of interest. And in this scatter plot, you can see the CISC scores plotted on the y-axis and viewpoint scores plotted on the x-axis. Each dot represents an individual text as read by an individual participant. And again, the narratives are in purple and the expository texts are in green. And what we can see from this figure is that there is a small but significant relationship between CISC scores and viewpoint scores, such that the more viewpoint markers a text contains, the lower social curiosity after reading. So let's sum up what we've done and found in this project. We started out with our question of whether perhaps reading a piece of narrative fiction, as opposed to expository nonfiction, could affect social curiosity after reading. Our hypothesis was that narrative fiction would lead to higher social curiosity, which may explain previous findings of a facilitatory effect of single exposure to narratives on social cognitive performance. Our main finding was that, contrary to our hypothesis, social curiosity was actually lower after reading a piece of narrative fiction than after reading a piece of expository nonfiction. And in addition, we found that this effect may be driven by the presence of viewpoint markers or the degree to which text contains social targets. So what's our take on this somewhat surprising finding? Well, we have three possible explanations. First of all, it might be the case that narrative fiction induces a social cognitive fatigue. Because narratives engage our social cognitive abilities, we might fatigue those abilities and then either be less willing or less able to use them again, which makes us less curious about engaging with other people. An alternative explanation is that narrative fiction fulfills our social needs, and this is in line with both the temporarily expanding the boundaries of the self model as well as research on social snacking. The idea being that if we have social needs but no actual people around, a narrative can act as a social surrogate and fulfill our social needs. A final explanation could be that expository nonfiction triggers a need for social reconnection. And this is in line with the research that suggests that after social inclusion, people have a higher need to reconnect. So in that sense, reading a piece of expository nonfiction could perhaps be seen as a form of social exclusion. Note that we cannot tease apart these explanations because we don't have any baseline data. So we don't actually know whether narrative fiction decreases social curiosity or expository nonfiction increases social curiosity. So how does this tie into previous accounts that do suggest that over the long run, reading narrative fiction would positively impact your social cognition? To understand how these findings are compatible, it's useful to think of the muscle metaphor that was originally introduced by Lisa Suncha. Just like working out for 10 minutes, for example, doing push-ups for 10 minutes will make your muscles tired, reading a narrative for 10 minutes will make your social cognitive muscles tired, leading to a temporary fatigue. So if you would do push-ups for 10 minutes, it's not likely that that would increase your chances of winning an arm press battle right afterwards. But if you regularly work out, for example, read 10 minutes or do push-ups for 10 minutes over a year, that could still lead to long-term improvement. And so in that sense, a temporarily short-term fatigue is still compatible with long-term improvement. And that brings me to our take-home message. The effect of reading narratives on social cognition depends on the time scale that we investigate. On the short term, reading a narrative may have a completely different effect than on the long run if we repeatedly expose our participants to narratives. And so we need better accounts and better studies that explicate and investigate the duration and frequency of exposure to narratives that is needed to obtain certain effects. Thank you again for checking out my presentation. Here are the resources again if you want to know more about this work. Let me know if you have any questions. I'm happy to answer them, and I hope to see you all in Italy soon to discuss this work. And here are the references in case you want to check out any of the previous work that this project built on. Bye!